What does holding space mean, and why is it important for relationships and cultivating connection? In this episode, I share 6 components of holding space, and I check in with author and Dare to Lead facilitator Nicole Lewis-Keeber. Welcome to the Abundance Hack Show, where we are inspiring you to ditch the outdated beliefs, release the blocks, and fully embrace your sovereignty so you can confidently expand to allow more love, joy, and aligned success in your life. I am Niajae, your conscious accountability partner, reminding you that abundance is your birthright. Hey M&Ms, thank you for tuning in to the Abundance Hack Show. What are you manifesting in your life today? In this episode, we are going to talk about holding space. At some point, I became really obsessed with emotional intelligence and really cultivating deeper connections. For years, I used to say, we have to cultivate deeper connections. We have to cultivate deeper connections, not really knowing the depth of what that actually means. And I feel holding space is something that a lot of people say, is something I say a lot, but I think that it means something different to each person. So I think that demystifying what it means to hold space and really breaking it down, because I think that a lot of people think they're great communicators. I think I'm a great communicator, but it took practice. I wasn't always a great communicator. I come from a family that are very loud. I'm from New York. So I come from a family that's very loud when it comes to having a conversation, especially an intense or uncomfortable conversation. Speaking loudly, screaming, talking over you, intimidating you to get you to see their point is kind of how I was raised. And so in my adult life, I realized, okay, this is not an effective way to communicate. So I got really into communication and trying to figure out why I felt like a lot of relationships and friendships and connections were very surface and superficial. So I've been doing a lot of work on intimacy, and obviously I talked about my intimacy coaching. It's not about sex, it's about deepening connection with the people in your life. And I think that these topics trickle over into every area of life. So friendships, relationships, your relationship with your family, business, et cetera, et cetera. So holding space is something that's really important for every type of relationship in your life. And if you want to really have a deep connection with someone, you have to be able to hold space for different reasons. Being there for people so the people in your life feel supported and nurtured, and then also being able to have those uncomfortable conversations that actually create depth in relationships. So if you Google holding space, this is the actual definition that comes up. Being physically, mentally, and emotionally present for someone. It means putting your focus on someone to support them in their feelings. An important aspect of holding space means managing judgment while you are present. So, being present, I think right now is more difficult than ever because we have cell phones and we are constantly on our phone, constantly scrolling social media, constantly looking down. So, a lot of times we're not even looking people in their eye anymore. We're not even looking people in their face because we're constantly looking down at our phones while we're talking to people, if we're even talking to people in person. Because now with social media, we communicate so much over social media that we're not even connecting in person as much. And then also, we did go through a pandemic, so that contributes a lot to it. But even before the pandemic, and I do record this podcast to be timeless, so even without that, I think a lot of people with cell phones have just gotten to the point to where we don't call each other anymore, we text. If my phone rings, I look at it like, what is going on here? We don't call people anymore. We text, we check on people through social media. So we've definitely lost some connection. So, holding space, I think, is more important than ever. And holding space to deepen connection with the people in your life is crucial. So, I have 6 ways or 6 components, I should say, to holding space. Number one is practicing active listening. This is so important. If you didn't tune into my emotional intelligence episode with Coach Antisa Jensen, it's a really good one about emotional intelligence and how a lot of times we're listening to respond, we're listening to react. And she takes it even further, saying sometimes we listen to understand, which, there's different layers of it, but listening to react or listening to respond, you're not actually trying to hear the person. So practice active listening, and don't listen just to respond or react. And sometimes we try to predict what the person is going to say. Sometimes we're listening to figure out what we should say and what they want from us. But I think that if you can just really be present and just listen, that will mean a lot to the person. And I also think that asking when a person is done, well, one, I love when people say thank you for sharing, because it feels like I hear you. And I'm here for you to share your feelings and emotions. And then asking, do you want feedback? Do you want my advice? Do you want me to just listen? Do you want me to just be a shoulder or an ear for you to share what is on your heart? So, really asking a person what they expect of you rather than assuming they want my advice, they want my opinion. And sometimes people just want to be heard. So number 2 is don't jump into problem solving mode. So this definitely speaks to what I was just saying. People usually don't want you to try to solve their problems. And let me not say usually. I can only speak for myself in this case. I am someone who, I don't necessarily like advice from people. And I'm going to be really honest with you guys, because that's what I do, right? I share what's on my heart. I usually don't like advice from people who don't have the life that I want to live, or don't have the situation that I want to have. So, for example, for someone who doesn't own a business, or they don't own the type of business that I have, sometimes I'm not interested in their advice. Now, I think there's a difference in opinion and advice. Opinion is, well, if I was you, I would do this. That's their opinion of how they would respond to a situation. Advice is more like, well, I think you should do this. I think there's a little bit of a difference there. And usually, I'm someone who likes to do brain dumps because I have a lot going on in my head. I'm sure you're not surprised. I have a lot going on in my head, and it really helps me to speak things out. I'm an extrovert. So, with extroverts, speaking things, getting them out, exiting from your brain out into the universe just helps me with clarity. So a lot of times when I speak to people, it's just getting the thoughts out of my head, and I'm able to hear what I'm saying and make sense of it, because it's not all like jumbled in my head. It also works if I journal, but obviously I like talking because I have a podcast. So sometimes people don't want you to problem solve. Sometimes they just want you to listen. Sometimes they want a sounding board. And I think that some people don't want to be sounding boards, especially when you have someone like me that talks a lot. But sometimes people need that. Sometimes people want that. And I think that not jumping into that problem solving mode makes a person feel like you're there, and you're a shoulder and you're an ear, and someone they can depend on, and they feel fully supported. So, number 3 is don't make it all about you. And I am guilty of this. Okay. So, this is not like a slap on the wrist. This is just like, hey, if you want to deepen your connections, these are some things to take a look at. I am definitely someone who tends to make it all about me. I'm being honest, but there was something that I read online that I think is really powerful. So I'll read it. It says, don't center yourself. We know it's often easier to understand something when we can relate it back to ourselves. Try to resist the urge to insert yourself in the situation. There's a time and place to talk about your experiences, but holding space isn't it. Keep your own issues and experience separate from this interaction so you can focus on being there for the other person. Sometimes this is really hard for me because I have lived a really full life. I've lived in 7 different states. I've started several different types of businesses. I've traveled. So usually I have a story for everything. So I try sometimes I like to share my stories because, I obviously I have a podcast. I like telling stories. But when you're holding space for someone and they are in the midst of their story, really just letting it be about them and letting them share their experience, and when they feel seen and heard, then you could be like, "Oh, this reminds me of X, Y, and Z," but really giving people space to be heard and seen. And I think that our intentions are good because it's kind of like, oh, I can relate because I experienced this, but sometimes people just need a moment to shine, and I think that there's enough time and space for us all to shine. So giving the other person their time to shine and paying attention to them, I think it's really simple when you put it that way, but it's a little more difficult to actually execute. But it's just stuff that I'm like, hey, let's pay attention to this if we really want to deepen our connections with people in our lives. Number 4 is be open to whatever comes up. And this is emotions, this is feelings. And sometimes people get really uncomfortable with emotions. Like if someone starts crying, we, thinking that we're helping, want to stop them from crying or kind of not shush them because that sounds bad, but we are sometimes uncomfortable with people showing emotions or crying. So we want to stop them from crying, but we're actually encouraging them to suppress their emotions, which is not healthy because suppressed emotions turns into trapped emotions turns into physical ailments turn into disease. You know how I feel about that. So it's really important that we hold space and allow people to express whatever emotions or feelings come up. If they cry, sit with them. There's a really powerful, oh, I wish I had the book. It's like sitting on my bookshelf kind of far, and I'm not going to get up and get it, but it's a poem from Araya that talks about, she says something along the lines of, can you sit with my pain and yours without trying to fix it, change it, move it? So sometimes we are uncomfortable with other people showing emotions, so we try to fix it, solve it, move it, change it, whatever. But sometimes people just need to sit in how they're feeling so they can honor it fully before releasing it or moving on. So I think that's something really powerful to think about. Can you sit with uncomfortable emotions without trying to get the person to shift out of that space for your comfort? And vice versa. Do you feel comfortable sitting in your emotions? A lot of times we suppress our own emotions because we think we're making other people uncomfortable, but everyone's in control of their own experience. So really honoring our feelings and emotions, I think, is really, really important. And making sure that you are holding space for others and also making sure that you're holding space for yourself. Are you giving yourself time to sit in what you're feeling and honor how you're feeling? Or are you suppressing and numbing? The more we can hold space for ourselves and be able to sit in that uncomfortable feeling to sort through whatever muck is there, the more that we're going to be able to hold space for others. So this goes in all 3 directions: holding space for others, communicating how you want people to hold space for you, and also holding space for yourself. All right. Number 5 is be vulnerable. So you guys know I love Brene Brown, which is why I thought it was so important that I have Nicole Lewis-Keeber on this episode, because she is a certified Dare to Lead facilitator, and Brene Brown is all about vulnerability. And a lot of people think that vulnerability is a sign of weakness, but it's actually the opposite. Being vulnerable takes courage, it takes strength, it takes resilience to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations and show up without our armor. When we have armor, which I'm going to get to in a minute, then we're not actually being vulnerable, and we're not displaying courage because we're closed off. So remaining open even when it's uncomfortable and painful, and sometimes it just sucks, but being able to lean in and say, hey, I'm here. And one thing that I'll share, a little bit of a personal story. So I moved around a lot as a child, and I've told this story several times. In 12 years of grade school, I went to 11 different schools. And in high school alone, I went to 3 different high schools in 3 different states in 4 years of high school. So I learned how to make friends. I learned how to meet people. I didn't learn how to maintain friendships. So a lot of this stuff is stuff that I had to learn later on down the line, because I was very much so in this space where we're friends, you make me mad, I'm over you, and I'm going to go make a new friend, because it was easy for me to make new friends. But I never learned, because I moved around so much, how to keep friends over long periods of time. And I never learned how to work through challenges. So you have situations where you're going to get on each other's nerves. You have situations where you're going to be mad at each other. You have situations where you're going to disagree, but you work through those. And that's a part of life. That is a part of life. And you have situations where your family drives you crazy, but you have to be able to work through it. You have situations where your boss or your coworker or your staff or whatever it is drives you crazy, but you have to work through it. So these fundamentals, I think being able to hold space is a fundamental to relationships. It's a fundamental to cultivating deeper connections, and it trickles over into every type of relationship in your life. All right, so number 6. So these are the things that you have to remove in order to hold space. So removing ego, pride, shame, or blame. So ego, pride, shame, or blame, these are things that will get in the way of you truly being able to hold space for someone. And I have 2 additional ones: defensiveness and comparison. So ego is something that I've spoken a lot about as well. I don't think that ego is a bad thing. Ego is designed to protect us. It's designed to protect our inner child. So when ego flares up, that just means our inner child is a little offended. But we have to put our ego in check, because sometimes how we're viewing things, our perspective is from a lens of pain versus what is actually happening. We can take offense to something that someone didn't mean offensively because we're in our ego. So ego isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just designed to protect us. But if we can remain open and remove our armor and be vulnerable and lean in and say, hey, I'm hearing this. This is what this sounds like to me. This is what this is making me feel like. Then we can potentially peel the layers back, because a person may say, no, I didn't mean it that way. That's not what I meant. That's not what I was saying. But if we're in our ego, we're going to get defensive. We're going to blame or feel shame or feel defensive. Then we're not actually getting to the connection and to the understanding. So when you have uncomfortable conversations, the objective should be to get to a neutral place. Not they have to agree with you, you have to agree with them, you have to see things eye to eye, but at least understand where each other is coming from. So pride is another one. Pride creeps up when you're in your ego. So there's a lot of times where we want to defend ourselves. We want to defend ourselves and stand our ground so this person gets us. And it's okay to disagree. It's okay to see things differently because everyone is different. No two people are exactly the same. You're not going to see things the same way because we have different thought processes. We have different backgrounds. We have different attachment styles and different communication styles and all these different things. So sometimes people are just going to see things differently and that's okay. So creating space for people to share how they feel, how they think, what's going on without you trying to change their mind and vice versa, without them trying to change your mind and saying like, hey, I respect how you feel and I feel this way. So it doesn't have to be, but I feel this way. It's a yes and. So yes and is probably one of the most powerful things that I think that we can adapt, learning how to not make it right or wrong. I understand what you're feeling, and here's how I feel. So you're welcome to feel this way, and I'm welcome to feel this way. We don't have to feel the same way. You don't have to try to change my mind on how I feel. I don't have to try to change your mind on how you feel. The purpose is for us to understand how we feel, how the other person feels, how understand how we feel, understand how the other person feel, and just be able to know moving forward. So I could talk about this all day because I feel really passionate about the the topic, but just to reiterate, removing ego, pride, shame, or blame, also blaming. So this is something really important that I believe Brene Brown talks about a lot as well, and just emotional intelligence when you are communicating with someone. So rather than saying you hurt me, that's blame. You can say, I felt hurt when X, Y, and Z occurred. So when you said, like, if someone said something, I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of an example right now, but rather than saying you hurt me when you said this, you can say when you said this, it hurt my feelings. So it's not blaming the person, it's being responsible for your own perspective and your own feelings without blaming the person. Because a lot of times, I mean, obviously there are people that are just like hurtful, but a lot of times we don't even know that we're hurting someone because most people, most normal people don't set out the intention to hurt someone. So rather than blaming them, you can say, hey, this is a trigger for me. Is your intuition getting stronger and it's freaking you out a little bit? Are you seeing repeating numbers everywhere and you don't know what it means? Do you feel or hear things but you don't know how to make sense of it? Do you know the law of attraction is real and feel shame when you have a negative feeling? Abundant and Aligned Society is a support and accountability group for those beginning their spiritual or healing journey and are just waking up to their powers and clear abilities. Go to Niajae.com for more information on this membership that offers sound therapy recordings, guided meditations, journal exercises, and more to help you avoid the pitfalls and maintain alignment as you raise your level of consciousness. Connect with me if you are ready to gain clarity and start vibrating higher. Okay, so the two things that gets in the way of holding space for someone is defensiveness. So if you're defensive, that means that whatever's going on is bringing up some shame or some guilt or triggering you in some way. So defensiveness is something that will stand in the way of really healthy communication and getting to that understanding. In comparison, this is I think a big thing between women. I would say I don't really listen to like bro conversations to know like if this is something with guys, but I know with women this is a thing. So if you share like, oh, I went on vacation and I was in Paris, blah blah blah, it's almost like some women feel the need to be like, oh, I've been to Paris too, and or like that type of thing. Sometimes that gets in the way of the connection. So being able to hold space and let the other person shine. There is enough time for all of us to shine. So if someone's sharing a story let them share their story. Let them feel heard, because we all crave to feel heard. So I think that it's important, while we are giving other people space to share, we feel comfortable sharing as well, because there's some people that don't feel comfortable sharing for various reasons. And when I tell stories, because I tell a lot of stories, I send a lot of voice memos. I always make it a point, after I've sent, a lot of voice memos, or shared a long story, I always make it a point to be like, how are you? What's going on with you? How's this? And like, bring up specific things, because it's like my way of saying thank you for holding this space for me. Now let me hold space for you. So that's just something that I do, and I always make it a point to do it, because I know I talk a lot, and I don't want to be that one-sided friend where I'm doing this like 30-minute brain dump and I'm not hearing what you have to say. So these are things that I've put into practice after doing some inner work, doing some coaching, because it wasn't something that just came naturally. And I don't think that communication is something that's just taught. So that's why I wanted to create this episode. And let's hear from Nicole Lewis-Keeber. All right, so we have Nicole Lewis-Keeber here. And if you didn't check out my podcast episode with her, where she talks about identifying trauma in your business, definitely go back and check that out. And since we've filmed that episode, I've actually taken one of her programs, the Do No Harm. It's a trauma-informed program, and I learned so much from her. And I just purchased her brand new book, How to Love Your Business. So when we get into topics that I feel really passionate about, like holding space and really communicating from a place of emotional intelligence, I think that leadership is something that is really important, understanding how to communicate with people, and communicate with people in your personal life, your business life, and really holding space for yourself. So, Nicole, thank you for joining me to talk about this topic.
Thank you.
And I guess like my first question is, what does holding space mean to you?
Yeah, I think that this is one of those things that means different things to different people. And for me, what it means is to be present to the person, to yourself, the moment, and kind of the purpose in which you're together. So it's very intentional, and it's intentional, it's purposeful, and you are constantly kind of checking in with yourself and the temperature of the container and the person that you're with. So it's like
Mm.
you're literally holding the space energetically.
So I know that container, I love that you said the word container, because container is something that you talked about in the Do No Harm program, about creating a safe container for your clients. And when you're holding space for someone, what are some ways that you can create a safe container where people feel comfortable sharing with you?
Yeah, so I think it depends on, what that container is. So if it's you and one other person, um, and these overlap, but there's a little bit of a difference depending on what it is. But if you're with another person, holding that space in that container and to create as much psychological safety as possible, is first of all, there needs to be consent between both people and being present in that moment, right? It's both people consent to being there, and it's a good time to do it. And it is kind of identifying personally for yourself, what is my role in this conversation, or what is my role in this interaction? Because if you're not clear about why you're there, you're not going to be able to hold space for anybody, right? And so I think it's also, kind of defining what's okay and what's not okay in that exchange or that interaction. And so what you're doing is you're being very clear, because remember, Brene Brown says clear is kind. So if it's just me and you, and I'm holding space in this, container, is to say, um, I've invited you in here for this reason, like we've come together for this reason. You're being explicit about the reason as to why you're there. Um, and you're, asking the other person, what their expectation and their understanding is about this, the container that you're in, so it's very explicit. You're moving slow. You're checking in with yourself about how you feel about why you're there and how the other person may feel about why they're there. And kind of checking in with yourself along the way to see, am I feeling activated? Am I getting defensive? Am I feeling triggered? So it requires, I think what it means is it's requiring a lot of intentional, purposeful conversation between you and the person, or even you and the group. And group dynamics can be a little bit different. We can talk more about that. But I think it always comes down to you and why you are there and what you think that the purpose of the meeting is, or the container.
Yeah. So let's break it down really specific. Let's take personal
Mm-hmm.
relationships
Mm-hmm.
first. So with a personal relationship, whether it's like a friend, a family member, I think that when you have communication and people are afraid to be vulnerable, and I guess people are afraid to be vulnerable because it's a defense mechanism. They're protecting their hearts. So what are some ways that someone can create a safe container for someone in their life to feel comfortable being vulnerable with them? And so they know that like this person is holding space. It's safe for me to be vulnerable. So if it's a personal situation, like what are some action steps or things they can say that will help create that container?
Yeah, I think that we always have to know that we cannot predict how other people are going to respond to us. Like we may have all the all the plans laid out, and we don't know. And so if you are okay with that and already have done some internal work about what that might look like, I think that that's the very first thing. Because we can't force vulnerability, and we can't always create a safe space for others, because we don't know what safety looks like for them. So I think saying that out loud matters, because then you kind of take that huge expectation off of yourself, and so that you can kind of roll with what comes up. And so I think that's the most important thing. I think that also identifying like what it is that we're kind of hoping to have happen, like what's our role and what's kind of like almost our agenda in this, and checking in with ourselves to say, is this a logistical agenda? Is this emotionally driven? Do I have some stealthy and intentions around what I want to have happen because I have some stake in this, or am I really creating a space where I just want to be here for this person to listen, and help them feel like they have someone that they can talk to. So there's a lot of self inquiry that goes into that approach, right? And so then the very next thing is, consent, asking that person, saying, either, do you have some time to talk? I would really like to have a conversation now, later, when might that be? So what you're doing in that situation is you're putting some of the power back into their court by giving them some choice and agency over what happens next. So and be ready to say, yes, that works for me, no, that does not work for me, and try to find some common ground. Because if I come into it because I want to have this, I'm wanting to hold space for someone to be vulnerable around some kind of conversation, and I say, I need to talk to you at 3 o'clock today. Can you come to my office, or can you come and can we meet in the kitchen? Like whatever it is, if you are directing that person, you've already kind of shifted the energy and the power dynamic with that person. So if you really want them to feel safe and feel like they can be vulnerable, you need to give them some power in that exchange as to what happens. So those are the very first two things to do. Any questions about that?
I love it. So I want to echo, you said we don't know what safety looks like for others. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's something really, really important for people to really let sink in. Like, I know what feels safe for me, but it could look completely different for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So being open to other perspectives of, I feel like if let's just take my partner, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like if we have a conversation in our bedroom, it's a calm, safe environment, but he may feel like this doesn't feel safe. Like, let's go for a walk outside and, it's open and airy. Like it's a silly example, but just to be open to other perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And when you ask for consent, being prepared or being okay with a no and not
Mm-hmm.
attaching like ego and pride to it, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we'll allow our feelings to get hurt if someone says, no, this is not a good time for me to talk, I'm not in a place to discuss this right now. And I know that with my upbringing, like I have a mom that's like, no, you're going to talk about this now.
Mm-hmm.
But I've realized that that's not really healthy. Forcing someone to talk when they're not ready to talk can be damaging.
Yeah, it can be very damaging, and I think many of us grew up, as kids where, there wasn't a lot of agency or consent involved in it. It's like, do it now. I don't care what you want, and that's, I guess that's fine. We have parents who are directing us and have the end result kind of comes down to them, that we kind of get kind of pulled up and lost around in the shuffle a bit. But when we're having adult relationships with people that we care about and want to feel safe, whether it's personal or other, we have to allow for that partnership and the exchange of energy, the consent around what happens, and really listening to that person about what safety means. So, if I want to have a conversation, with my husband about our love life or about anything like that, I might think the bedroom's a really great place to do that, just like you mentioned. But he may want to have it in the kitchen because he doesn't want that to taint the bedroom. Like, you just never know what that other person may need. And so I always say, when in doubt, check it out. And so, giving that person a heads up and saying, I think we need to have a conversation about X, Y, and Z. I really want to have it sooner than later. When's a good time for you? Where would you feel comfortable having that? Just be very explicit. I think people appreciate having those options.
Yes, I love it. I love it. So, when we get into business, I think that business dynamic is a little different than
Mhm.
personal. So, if someone is trying to hold space business wise, and I'm someone who, when I had a brick and mortar business and I was managing a team, I felt like managing people was one of the hardest things about running a business for me
Oh yeah.
personally. So, how do you, because there were times where I thought I was motivating people and they took it as I was putting them down.
Mhm.
So I feel like holding space for people in business is very different because things can be taken the wrong way. So, what are some ways people can hold space in a business relationship or dynamic?
Yeah, I think I was a shitty manager. Let me just tell you. We didn't get training. Like, I was in the mental health industry. There's no training on how to be a manager there. So I made a ton of mistakes. And I think part of the thing is that when we try and cram everything into a staff meeting, like all the celebrations, the directives, the new policy, like all that, when you try and cram everything into that one meeting, um, I think that we do ourselves a disservice because there's no boundaries, there's no processing of information. Any kind of celebration that you have that's also connected with performance issues, like, it's just not going to land. So you might as well just not. So I think that in these situations around giving feedback and creating these containers is to have some separation between the agenda and the purpose of those meetings, because you could have a 30-minute really purposeful meeting on the direction of your business and what people's kind of down and dirty jobs are really quickly, and then have a beautiful leisurely hour-long meeting once a month where you really just enjoy the process of being in business with each other and getting to know each other. But I think so often, because of time, people try and cram all those things together, and that really is, I think that it does a disservice to the morale, the cohesiveness, the psychological safety in the room.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how do you feel about a criticism sandwich? I feel like it's a random question, but I kind of was taught at one point to, say something positive, give the constructive criticism, and then follow up with something positive. How do you
Mhm.
feel about that process?
I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. And since I've done all this training with Dare to Lead, with Brene, we go through, pretty extensive conversations on, like, giving engaged feedback and, what it means to be ready to give it yourself. Because I think a lot of times we don't ask ourselves if we're ready to give feedback to people. And we need to be in a good space to be able to do it. Um, and she has a whole list in her book, Dare to Lead, on giving engaged feedback, that we can refer people to. So it starts with you, always, always, always starts with you. Are you ready energetically to give feedback to that person? Do you feel like that you can sit next to them without being aggravated? Can you get close to them? Can you give them more praise and criticism? are you ready to acknowledge what they do well in a larger proportion to what they're not doing well? Because I think that's what kind of happens with that, um, I forget, someone called it something funny, but yeah, the praise and then the shit and then the praise again. Is that it feels like it's more praise than not, but it's really kind of manipulative in a way, I think. So I think when
Hmm.
we can be really honest with people and say, I this is what the conversation is. These are some of the things we're going to cover. And I'm hoping that you'll feel more encouraged than defeated at the end of this, because there's much more that's going right than these few little things that we need to adjust. So I think, sometimes when we can be a little bit more explicit like that than, the random formulaic, you know, way that we're taught to give feedback, because we're all expecting it, right? As soon as we hear the praise first and someone's called us into their office, we know the shit's coming next, right? We know. So I don't know. I think it's kind of played out at this point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's why I asked, because I felt like after going through your program, you offered a lot of different perspectives that are just a lot more down to earth and straightforward with people, so they don't feel manipulated. And when you say, "Are you in an energetic space to give feedback?" Are you specifically referring to, because in my head, this is what it means, removing ego or pride or blame and
Hmm.
like coming from a neutral place?
Yeah, like if you just, and well, I'm kind of speaking from a corporate setting, but hopefully people can, you know, kind of pick it up and take it over here to wherever they are. If you just came from some place where you got criticized or told that your performance is not working, or you just saw that you have bills that are due and you're seeing that the bills are due because someone didn't pay them, or like whatever. If you're coming directly from that like heightened energy moment into giving that person that feedback, you're probably not going to be ready to do that. So when I say energetically, I have the list right here. Brene says, are you open to owning your part of why the situation is not working? And I think a lot of times when we're giving feedback and creating those conversations with people within our business structures, that we have to own our part of it. If we cannot do that when we're giving feedback to someone else, we are not ready, or we are not being clear about what's happening, and we're not standing in our leadership either, because when it comes down to it, it's your business, you're the it's your leadership that's taking that person down that path. And so, yeah, if you're not willing to own your part, and if you can't hold that person accountable without shaming or blaming them and see more of their strengths, you're not energetically in a place to do it. So you need to take a minute. So, and what else does she say here? If you need to be able to talk about what resolving those challenges looks like, as opposed to just giving it the feedback, like how do we operationalize what comes next, what is the resolution of the challenge, right? Not just there is one. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So, as far as holding space for ourselves, because I think that a lot of people are used to holding space for others,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
we tend to do harm to ourselves. Just like your program, like do no harm, one of the first things is making sure you're not doing harm to yourself. So
Mm-hmm.
how can one hold space for themselves?
So I think at the end of the day, we have to be able to tap into the experience that we're having, to be able to check in with ourselves and see what emotions are coming up for us. And as Brene Brown says, what is the shitty first draft? Meaning, like, what is the story I'm telling myself about the situation? Um, because if I'm going to go into that exchange with some internal dialogue about what this all means, and what this means about me, and the story I'm telling myself is probably much more dramatic than is probably needed. um, I'm not holding space for myself, because I'm letting myself be directed by my emotion, maybe my trauma, my triggers. And, that's not holding space for me before we do this. So it's about tapping into, what's coming up for you. What do you need as well to feel secure in that situation? And what is the story that you're telling yourself? And do you have enough data to freak out about this thing? It's one of the questions I ask myself all the time. It's like, do I have enough data here to freak out?
So you said trauma and triggers. So how can someone identify if they're looking at a situation from a lens of trauma or trigger?
Probably you're feeling something in your body, that is feeling uncomfortable. Like maybe your stomach hurts, or maybe your chest is tightening, or maybe you have a ringing in your ears. Like I think many of us experience our nervous system in a heightened trigger around anxiety or stress, or in different ways. And so I think it's like tapping into what that looks like for you. And then also, if you find yourself kind of sitting in some emotion that feels like, oh gosh, this, I feel like a loser because this didn't work, or like kind of that inner dialogue starts around who you are in the world about this. And it feels really, really familiar to how you were treated or told you who you were as a kid. Those usually are triggers related to trauma. So you're having a nervous system response, which is activating that internal dialogue. And then we usually have some kind of reaction or action to that. So that's kind of how the trigger can happen for us. And if we're activating any kind of container holding, feedback giving, or anything like that from a place of trigger or trauma, it's not going to have the effect that we're looking for.
Hmm. Yes, I totally agree. So I feel like we're in a society that teaches people to suppress their emotions and kind of bottle things up, and then
Mm-hmm.
we put our best foot forward on social media. So do you have any last tips for people that want deeper connections, that really want to be able to hold space, but they're like, vulnerability makes me
Mm-hmm.
nervous? Do
Mm-hmm.
you have any last tips for that?
Well, first is that we have to understand that holding space for others still requires their participation, and that we are not 100% accountable for that experience. We are not gods. At least I don't think that I'm the end all be all. I don't have that kind of control over other people. So being realistic about the situation is important. Um, and you mentioned something about social media, like it jumped out of my head, so I wanted to make sure I touched on that. Um,
Well, I find that a lot of people are putting their best foot forward on social media, and they're
mhm,
not comfortable being vulnerable in a sense of like, I'm having a hard time. And
mhm,
I found that like lately I've been really honest about like my life. Like when people are like, "How are you?" I'm like, life's kind of hard right now. And I feel like it makes people uncomfortable because
mhm,
they're so used to people saying, "I'm great, I'm well, I'm fine." And so just like speaking to that about just the society we live in right now, people
mhm,
are not always comfortable with being vulnerable or
mhm.
even someone else being vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that it comes down to, first of all, recognizing it's a biological response. Our survival brain sees that, feels that, and wants to shut it down because it doesn't feel comfortable. It's out of our comfort zone. It's not what we're socialized to do. So recognizing, first of all, that it's a biological response. It's normal, and that's okay. And that it's doing its job and saying thank you, and then say, but yeah, I still want to really show who I am and the realness of my life with folks. So, I'm going to do this anyway. So hopefully you'll get on board, little nervous system. Um, and I think naming it and saying, this is what my life looks like right now. This is the honest truth about what's happening. And then, just knowing that other people are not conditioned to be able to see that, hold space for you. Um, but to not let that deter you, because the next level of leadership in this world, whether it's in the healing arts, um, government, academia, it's all for people who are willing to lead from a place of courage and vulnerability. So just because other people can't really tolerate it or see it yet doesn't mean that you should hold back. So take care of yourself when it comes to how vulnerable you feel like you can express yourself, reminding your nervous system that you're safe and okay, and that it's going to take time for people to get used to that. But the you know, the gifts of the leaders of the world that come next are the ones who are not afraid to be vulnerable, raw, and real about what it means to be human.
I love that. I love it. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that you would just have some really powerful tips on this topic. So do you want to tell us about your book before we go?
Oh my gosh. I know. Speaking about, holding space. Thank you. So yes, this is my new book, and it was a labor of love for 4 years. So talk about holding space for yourself and for others within this book. And it's one of the foundational pieces of the work that I do, where I help people understand the relationship that they have created with their business, and whether it supports them or whether it actually might be hindering them, and help them move through these processes so that they can begin to have a relationship with their business that they love, and where they're feeling supported. They feel like their business is a partner as opposed to a baby. I can't tell you how many people I hear who say, "This is my baby," and I'm like, I don't want my business to be a baby. I want it, pull its weight and like take care of me. So, yeah, so it's some of the processes that I use my clients on, helping them how to determine what kind of relationship with their business they want to have and how to sustain that.
I
Yeah.
love it. And that was one of the biggest reframes that you helped me with, because I would always say my business is my baby.
Mm-hmm.
And I have felt that. I felt that, burnt out or used by my business. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing all this work, but I'm not seeing the fruits of my labor. So that was a huge, huge, huge reframe for me. So I'm super grateful for you and all the work that you do.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Of
Appreciate it.
course. Thank you for being here. Nicole Lewis-Keeber is so amazing, and I have learned so much from her. So I'm super grateful she came on. So, really quick recap before we wrap up this episode. The things that stand in the way of holding space is defensiveness and comparison. And 6 things that contribute to being able to hold space is practice active listening, don't jump into problem solving mode, don't make it all about you. There will be a time where it can be all about you. And I think that we should take turns, holding space for each other. Number 4 is be open to whatever comes up, allowing the emotions and feelings to flow, honoring them without feeling like we have to dismiss them. Number 5 is being vulnerable. And number 6 is removing ego, pride, shame, or blame to just be vulnerable. Just it's a continuation from number 5. But I would love to hear how you feel about this episode. Are you holding space for people in your life? Are you holding space for yourself? Are the people in your life holding space for you? So these are really good things to think about. And again, I would love to hear your feedback. And I think that when it comes to cultivating deeper connections, there are a lot of layers. So, this is just one of the many, many layers, and it takes practice. So, be gentle with yourself. Again, like I said, it's not a slap on the wrist, because we're all learning, growing, and expanding. So, I hope you found value in this. If you know someone that needs to hear this, definitely share this episode. And until next time, be decadent. Thank you for tuning in to the Abundance Hack Show. I would love to hear from you. Leave your comments and questions, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our yummy episodes. Every time you leave a 5-star rating or review, I do my happy dance.